Hello, everybody. Blake Ryder here, Director of Hospitality Research with Lighthouse. And with me, as always, is Mr. Daniel Foreman. Daniel, please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hey, everybody. My name is Daniel Foreman. I'm a commercial strategist here at Lighthouse and also the host of our podcast. And for this session, I personally have a background in revenue management and commercial strategy. So as we walk through this data, I'm going to be kind of coming from that angle, and really excited to review this data with you, Blake, because me as a revenue manager, I've always had this kind of hunch and this suspicion that yes, my review scores really do matter in how I can price. So very excited to kind of actually see some numbers behind that today.
That's the goal today, to put numbers behind those review scores. And as far as I know, I think this is an industry first in terms of this type of analytics and the detail with which we are going to be getting in terms of how much those review scores matter. So let's just dive right in. Now, what are we talking about today? I think the best way to describe what we are talking about today is using a cycle. I love a cycle. Daniel, you like a cycle?
Love a cycle.
Love a cycle. So let's start the cycle. In the top of this cycle, a traveler makes a booking decision. They decide they want to go to Chicago, Miami, Finland, pick your location. Okay. They decide they're gonna make a booking decision. They book their hotel, they go on an OTA, they stay at that hotel, they hopefully have a good experience. And at some point thereafter, the hotel or the OTA usually will reach out to that traveler and say, hey, can you please review us? Could you give us some sort of quantifiable metric in terms of how likely you are to book this hotel again, to refer us to a friend of yours? And then hopefully that person does it. And then on the back end of that OTA, that review score is going to aggregate and spit out an aggregate number. So when people scroll through that OTA in the future, there's an aggregate review score for that property. Okay. And then at some point in the future, the revenue manager or the general manager of that property is going to set prices for future dates. Now, where we want to explore today is this relationship right here, this spot on the cycle. And just to be clear though, and Daniel, I want you to just kind of walk the viewers through this. We're not suggesting that this relationship is the only thing that drives pricing decisions, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So, just one disclaimer here, especially on that last stage of the cycle. We as revenue managers, we're looking at all sorts of things, right? We're looking at pickup and pace and how our competitors are pricing. So we don't want you to think that review score is the only factor in how you should price. So if you have a really good review score, don't just drop from the webinar and go price yourself at $5,000 tonight. Stick around. We'll show you some data that will give you a little bit better advice.
Oh, exactly. So we're going to show, what kind of edge you can get based on those review scores. So why are we doing this? A few reasons. First, I think that there are probably some viewers of this webinar who might have some untapped pricing power, meaning that based on their review score, they could theoretically charge more and they're not. So we want to ultimately kind of quantify how much each point of review score is worth to that property. And conversely, there may be some hotels that are wondering, why are we not getting the demand that we think we should be getting? And potentially there's a situation where they are overpriced, again, based on what their review score is. So we're going to dive into that. And at the end of the day, I think what we want to do is help people consider what strategic opportunities might be available to them and potentially tighten the screws on the operation to get those extra points, to get that extra 1/10 or 2/10 of a point in review score to give you that price elasticity that you are desiring. Number 3, and Daniel, I want you to give some color behind this. I think this might be the most important reason we're doing this. We want to bridge this gap between ops and revenue. Daniel, talk to me about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what do we mean by bridging the gap? So often, revenue managers and operations teams are operating in silos. So for example, operations, they may not be bringing up review score to the revenue department because they may assume that, the revenue manager just doesn't care. Or, vice versa, the revenue manager probably isn't bringing up review score with operations because, let's be honest, it's a little bit of like an awkward topic to just bring to a revenue call. Because I've heard that many times, right? A revenue manager will say like, how do they expect me to push rate? We've only got a 6.8 review score. This is impossible. So what we want to do by showing you this data is kind of create that icebreaker kind of that conversation topic that if you're a revenue manager, you can bring to your next strategy call to bridge that gap and kind of start that conversation with ops.
Totally. And what's also interesting is that I think the pricing that people pay, that is obviously in the control of the revenue manager, that pricing sets expectations that the ops team now needs to deliver on. So it's kind of a two-way street.
Exactly.
And the last reason we want to do this, we want to really show you guys, where, why, and by how much. Where are the markets where we see the most correlation between price and review score? Why do we think this is? And how much is each incremental point of review score worth? So we're going to dive into all that today. Just before we do, a couple of quick notes to point out. First and foremost, the data is largely pulled from booking.com, which is a 1 to 10 scale. So just to know, it is out of a scale of 1 to 10. Statistical correlation. So as we gathered all the data, which was a lot for this piece of analysis, we looked at different markets, and within those markets, we looked at different chain scales. So Tampa, 3-star, New York, 5-star, all the different markets as well as their star levels. So within that big pool of data, there were some markets that showed a lot of correlation, and some where the correlation was a little weaker. Anything where the correlation was weak, we pulled out. So any data that you see today, we feel has a strong basis of statistical correlation. And beyond that, every single piece of data you see will have at least 20 hotels aggregated into that piece of data. Length of stay 1. Daniel, talk to me about this and why it's important.
Yeah, so length of stay is very important because there are things like length of stay discounts out there. So if we had done this case study and we had shopped a mixture of 1 night and 3 night stays and 7 night stays, it wouldn't have been that apples to apples comparison. So, just to keep the data set clean, we did shop a length of stay 1. And then to that point, the next part of our methodology is this uniform distributed lead time. So here we did a maximum of 90 days, and it's for the exact same reason, right? If you shop a mixture of, 1 night, or 1 day before stays, 7 day before stays, 14 before, you'll get that advanced purchase discount kind of signal to noise in there. So this is just to keep the data set clean.
Perfect. And price increment. Okay, this is perhaps the most important piece of data or metric that we'll be discussing today. So want to spend a second on this. Price increment. What this means is the dollar amount that each 0.1, so each tenth of a point of review score, we believe that is the degree of elasticity, that upward price movement that you can expect for each additional tenth of a point of review score. So if we say a price increment is $3, that would mean that the difference between a 7.2 and a 7.3 rating would give you about $3 extra of pricing power. That's what price increment means. And lastly, all the data you see today is going to be in US dollars. We'll be looking at Europe. We'll be looking at the US. We're just keeping everything consistent in the USD just so we don't have any currency issues. So that being said, let's dive into this. Okay. So strongest correlations by region. We have some stats for the US and the Europe, and I'm going to dive into those in a second. But first, I just want to point out or explain what I mean when I say statistical correlation. Now, so the strongest correlations, what I mean by this is if you push review score up, that has the highest likelihood to drive pricing power. So just for argument's sake, if I said 2-star hotels in Tampa had a very strong correlation, that would mean that there's a strong likelihood that the higher rated hotels in that market at that star level, the higher rated ones should have a higher price. Okay? That's what I mean when I say strongest correlation. Now, the United States. So like I said before, we looked at a litany of markets, and within each market, different star levels. Okay? So of the strongest 25 correlations we observed in the US, and again, that could be, Tampa 2-star or Kansas City 4-star. Of the strongest correlations we observed, 24 of the top 25 strongest correlations we observed were in the 2-star and 3-star segments in the US. Now, why do we think that is? Think about hotels in the United States, okay? Mostly branded, not all, but majority is going to be branded. And at that 2- and 3-star segment, you're going to get a bed, you'll get some plumbing in the room. At the 3-star segment, you're maybe going to get some, more select service amenities, some F&B, small F&B, grab and go, something like that. But people generally are not staying at 2- and 3-star properties for the social scene or the restaurant or the vibe. It's more brick and mortar for place to sleep. So if you think about it, given the general homogeneity across product at that 2-star and 3-star level, if a hotel at that level is going to pull a lever to try to give themselves more pricing power, review score is going to be one of the main ways to do that, because again, mostly branded, they're limited within the confines to an extent of the brand standards in terms of changing that physical amenity profile. As a result of that, review score is going to be one of those primary levers to pull. And that's why we think the strongest correlations in the US are at that level. And Europe, talking about Europe, Daniel.
Okay, so if the US is the land of, lots of similarities and cookie cutter chains and things like that, Europe, it is very, very different. This is the land of differences. So what I mean by that is, first of all, there are a lot more independent hotels in Europe. So for every chain hotel in Europe, there are as many as 3 to 3.5 indie or independent hotels. So that alone creates a lot more variability in the different products that you get over in Europe. And even to ask that question, right? What does it mean to be a 3-star or a 4-star hotel in Europe? There's a much broader spectrum of what you can expect to get within just that star rating. And an example would be, you may book a 4-star hotel in Europe that has really nice amenities and has a restaurant and an ensuite in the room, but there may not be air conditioning, right? Because maybe it's in Norway or Iceland or something. So it's just very, very different. So this doesn't mean that review scores are not important in Europe. They are very important in Europe, but for a very, very different reason than in the United States. And another thing that we'll touch on as well in a lot more detail is going to be international travel and how much inbound international travel Europe has. It is orders of magnitude more than the United States. And as we will learn, international travelers do tend to rely on that review score for some reasons we'll talk about here in a bit.
So it's almost like the yin and the yang principle, where in the US, you have a lot of homogeneity and you need the review scores to differentiate. Whereas in Europe, especially at that 4-star segment, there's a lot of heterogeneity and you need the review score as kind of like this universal language to differentiate and communicate on a standardized basis.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah. Universal language. That's a perfect way to put it.
Yeah. Okay. So let's dive into the actual price increments. Now, we're going to start off with 2-star hotels, and we will start off with 2-star hotels in the United States. And what I have here is the top 10 largest price increments, which again is per 10th of a point of review score. These are the top 10 price increments for 2-star hotels in the US. So you're looking at this and you're probably thinking to yourself, okay, a couple of dollars mostly, other than San Diego and Dallas, which are above $3. Everything else is $2 and below. And that US 2-star average is $1.47. May seem insignificant. Is it really worth going crazy to get an extra 10th of a point for an extra dollar and change? Well, let's just take a step back and look at this on an annualized basis. And just let's, in a vacuum, assume that you got an extra $1.47 per room that you sold. And let's just use a hypothetical 2-star hotel in any town, USA. Let's just a couple of just quick assumptions. So $1.47, that is that average increment for 2-star properties in the US. So let's assume again 85 keys. Again, 2-star property with 68% occupancy, multiply it out by 365 days a year, and that is an additional $31,013 of additional revenue. Now, first and foremost, most important thing here, Daniel, that is a palindrome.
Exactly. What are the chances of that, right?
I did not solve to a palindrome. It just worked out that way. Super cool for 1-3. But I digress. That is not a small amount of money if you think about it. For a 2-star small property in any town, USA, that's actually quite a significant amount of money, I would say. And Daniel, so correct me if I'm wrong, but this is largely incremental revenue. This is talking about why it may have a snowball effect even.
Yeah. And this is huge, right? $31,000. If you're a revenue manager, that may be the difference between, making budget in 1 month or not making budget in another month. And like you said, I think that if you're able to increase your review score, it does create a snowball effect, right? Because you increase your review score, you're able to charge more of a rate premium. And at the same time, you're also, as you're booking more rooms, you're making more revenue, you're potentially moving up the page as well on that OTA or on that channel. So it just kind of adds that visibility and kind of creates that upward spiral.
Totally. Yep. We kept the occupancy consistent here. So, all right, let's move to 3-star. Now, So this is 3-star hotels in the US. Now, again, top 10 price increment. So the one thing that probably jumps out is that these are largely leisure destinations, right? You have New York and DC. Now, obviously, those are major business hubs, but also have significant leisure. But look at the rest: Monterey, Carlsbad, Santa Fe, Destin, St. Augustine, the oldest city in America. You have Naples, Palm Springs, obviously primary leisure. Okay, so let's discuss why we think that at the 3-star level, the top 10 largest are mostly going to be leisure-dominated markets. Now, 3-star properties, if you think about it, let's look at a market like in New York, because that's on the list. I think in a market like in New York, the 3-star properties, sometimes we'll log into an OTA and we'll say to ourselves, why is the Courtyard similar or the same or just maybe slightly less priced than the Marriott, the full-serve equivalent? And the same thing will happen, like why is the Hilton Garden Inn almost the same price as the full-service Hilton in this market? And I think at certain levels, and I think in certain markets, there are some places where a well-regarded 3-star property can really price up closer to their 4-star equivalent. I think markets like New York and DC definitely have that characteristic. And I think, honestly, strong leisure markets have that characteristic as well. These resort markets where, again, a very well-regarded 3-star asset has that upward mobility to kind of compete more directly with their 4-star counterparts. But now let's look at Europe. And Daniel, tell me what you see here in the Europe list.
Yeah. So in Europe, we're going to talk about, maybe a little bit different factors at play here. But one thing that's really interesting is that 3-star average, that the average pricing increment that you see there, that $2.57, it's very, very close to the US 3-star average of $2.69. So, I thought that was kind of interesting, just how close those are. But again, I think we're seeing, very different reasons here in Europe. So first of all, the big takeaway from this slide, or at least I thought this was the big takeaway, is if you look at the countries that are listed here, right? You've got a lot of Italy, you've got a lot of France, you have Spain, and you have Great Britain on here. So these are all in the top 5 markets for inbound international travel. Okay. And 3-star hotels, this is still a star level where that traveler is still, price is still top of mind, right? When we're looking at the 3-star level. So what I think going on is I think that we're really seeing this, these markets, these really marquee markets, they're very reliant on international travel. And I also think what's going on is a lot of people, they may be booking a once in a lifetime trip, right? If you look at some of the cities that are here, Rome and Verona and Sorrento, right? A lot of these cities people are only going to get to see one time, or they may only travel to one time, and they're building these different cities into a larger itinerary. And, there's a lot of choice out there as far as European hotels go. So I think that people are really relying on that review score to kind of make that final decision on where they're actually going to stay when they're building their big international travel plans.
It's a universal language, people, right? It transcends boundaries. Let's look at 4-star now for the US. Now, again, top 10. And what we see here is that it's pretty evenly split between leisure as well as primary metros. You have your New Yorks and Chicagos, but you also have your Florida Keys, your Savannahs, and your Palm Springs and your Anaheims. So this is what I think here. At the 4 and 5-star segments, at the higher end segments, people are generally less price focused and more focused on that amenity profile and the amenity quality, right? The quality of the amenities. Does it have the restaurant? Does it have the spa? Does it have that bar that I really want to go to? So I think at this level, since people care more about those amenities, they're looking at the review score to confirm the amenity quality, almost as a proxy for the amenity quality that they want. And I think that is applicable for leisure travelers to the Keys of Florida or to Savannah or to Palm Springs. And I also think that's very applicable to the business or group travelers going to New York or to Chicago. So I think that is why these are the types of markets that we are seeing in the top 10 price increment for 4-star. But now let's kick it over to Europe for Daniel, and you kind of walk us through what you see here.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, we have a very similar, if you look at the averages between the US and Europe. That 4-star price increment average is, again, very, very similar, which I thought was cool. But now we're starting to break into these European 4-star hotels. And really that 4-star level, kind of like you touched on, Blake, this is really that first star level where people are really focusing more so on the amenities, and price probably isn't necessarily the number one factor going on here. So there's some nuances to that, though. And you may notice at the very top of this list, we have Gran Canaria, right? It's very much like a premier beach destination. And we even kind of went back and forth on this, right, Blake? We were like, is there any way that's possible? Like $22, that's a huge price increment, right? If you go from a 7.1 to a 7.2, being able to price $22 higher. But when we dug into the data and we did some shops, what we noticed is there's a lot more variability in Europe at that 4-star level as far as what you can get. So we saw hotels that were technically 4-star, and they had a restaurant and they had a nightclub, but you could get them for €79. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there were hotels that, yes, they were 4-star hotels, and they had a 9.5 plus review score. And those were the hotels that were charging, in some cases, over €800 a night, and even a few hotels that we saw that were charging over €1,000 a night. So I think it really speaks to, in Europe, that 4-star rating, it's much more variable, and the amenities are a lot more variable, and you almost have kind of like this, even like a budget 4-star thing that you don't really have as much in the US. So I think the big takeaway from this slide is when you have a really broad range of offerings within your star level, especially if you're a European hotelier, there really is a huge incentive to boost your review score if you can, because it can lead to some really, really big price increases, or pricing potential increases.
Exactly. And then lastly, we'll go 5-star. So this is 5-star for the United States. Now this is a top 3. Now to reiterate, every data point you see has a minimum of 20 hotels, and then again we have to make sure they're all statistically relevant. So naturally, how many markets have 20 or more 5-star properties? And again, with statistical relevance, it for the U.S. was a top 3. But I wanted to still include this because we wanted to show you guys the degree of the size, that breadth of the increment at this 5-star level. We're seeing these, sexy cities, the Los Angeles, Miami Beach, New York, those markets with the sexy 5-star properties. And I think obviously the numbers are so high because to an extent, there's the least homogeneity across 5-star. There's effectively no cap. If you think about it, there's no 6-star properties. Everything kind of lumps in to 5-star. So when you have a market like in New York, there's luxury, and then there's like uber ultra luxury. And for that reason, since there's no 6th star, that's why the top of the market is so high. And if you think about it, it wouldn't be crazy to say, okay, this hotel is a 7.5 and this is a 9.5, and that's why that's almost $500 or whatever, $480 more at that level. So that's kind of what we see here in the 5-star rankings. And then how about Europe, Daniel?
Yeah. So first of all, you see a lot of different cities on here, right? We have a bigger sample size, more cities to look at here in Europe. Yeah. And this is where I think we're really starting to see, again, the international travel start to be really at the forefront. So what I think is going on here is, you have, like you said, there's no 6-star rating, right? So these are really premier, really, really nice hotels. And you've got people that are either coming for like a once in a lifetime trip to some of these really premier cities, or they're the kind of traveler who, isn't going to bat an eye at spending €2,000 a night, right? So you've got cities like Venice that are 86% international, where their travel comes from international inbound. Madrid is 56%. Milan is 56%. So again, it goes back to what Blake said earlier. Review score is that universal language. So if you've got someone who's, willing to pay 5-star pricing, they are going to want that premier experience. So the hotels that really do have that 9.5, 9.6, 9.7, the extremely high review scores, can expect to offer those higher pricing or those higher prices. And you see that again with like these cities like Milan in Italy, Madrid in Spain, Algarve, and then Venice, like we mentioned, that's really, really reliant on the international inbound.
And also, Daniel, 5 of the 10 here are in Italy, and the 3-star list, also 5 of the top 10 are in Italy. So we're also seeing
Yeah,
that Italy is definitely a country where people are willing to really pay for those higher review scores when they travel to Italy, which is
exactly.
interesting. So a couple of quick things before we sign off. When you have this type of data, you can make these really cool charts where you can kind of map out where pricing might be for a hypothetical hotel at a certain review score. To be abundantly clear, these are hypotheticals based on the data that we have, but you can kind of extrapolate these pricing curves. You can see here, this is in Manhattan as an example. We see the 3 and the 4-star groupings look nearly parallel. They look, and that's because their price increments are 16 cents apart. So basically, you just have this 4-star line starting $24 higher than the 3-star line. And that kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier. In a market like New York, we see these 3 and 4-star hotels priced fairly similarly in a market like Manhattan when there are so many other factors at play influencing their decision at that tier. And that's why you see such close pricing a lot of times between 3 and 4-star assets. And then conversely, with the 5-star, you have that acceleration upward. And again, that goes towards that 5-star $24 price increment. Charlotte, this is probably a bit smaller market, probably a little more in line with what might be expected to a traditional market. New York's kind of in a class of its own. But here, each progressive star level's price increment is larger than the previous one, resulting in that gap widening as we get higher and higher in those review scores. So a couple other quick things before we sign off. So Daniel, let's dive into this really quick. So this is kind of just taking going away from the analytics and just thinking, almost empirically about these ranking buckets. Talk to me about what you see here and why this really might matter and why a 7.9 to an 8 is more valuable than, say, a 7.5 to a 7.6.
Yeah, it's also beneficial to think about the actual, the shopper's behavior and how they're shopping for your hotel and how they find your hotel. Because, this is just anecdotal, but me personally, what I like to do when I shop on an OTA or even on a branded website is I will search by top review score, and then I'll also then filter by lowest to highest price. And what I'm doing there is I'm kind of looking for a diamond in the rough, right? That no one else has booked, but has a really, really good review score. And some OTAs like Booking.com have these ranking buckets. So if you want to filter out everything else that's lower than 9+, you can. So just imagine how powerful potentially it could be if you're able to take your review score from an 8.9 up to a 9, then that's going to be most likely much more valuable than just going from an 8.1 to an 8.2, right? Because it now puts you in this next highest ranking bucket. And that's what you're calling a kind of a fringe benefit of all of this, right, Blake?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. They'll kind of just very matter of fact, don't need super in-depth analytics to just realize how valuable that is. 100%. So, key takeaways from today's discussion. Now, ComSet may have strong correlation despite weak market correlation. I just want to take a second and discuss this. So, what this basically means is we obviously looked at the strength of the correlation, and just because a market overall might not have a strong correlation, that doesn't mean that your ComSet doesn't have a strong correlation. I imagine most people watching this are revenue managers or touch revenue in some way, and how often is it that a market does one thing, but your ComSet does something completely different? We've all been there, right? So if you think about it, just because a market overall doesn't have that correlation doesn't mean that your ComSet doesn't. So I would challenge you all that are watching this to look at your ComSets, look at their review scores, and look what they're charging, and then monitor that over time. And as their aggregate review scores change, if you see their pricing going up or down based on their review scores, you might have a more correlated market than you realize. So keep a mindful eye to that.
Exactly. And the next one here is that incremental gains amplify on an annual basis. So this is that snowball effect I was talking about earlier. If you're able to take your review score from an 8.1 to an 8.2, you can price more. You have more pricing potential. You're also going to move up the page on that channel, right? So it's going to give you additional opportunities there as well. And if you're able to maintain that over the course of a year, then again, those revenue benefits are just going to increase and increase.
As we saw in Europe, those higher increments, the significant international inbound tourism. We said it many times, the review scores transcend boundaries. And when you have that inbound tourism from international markets, that is when people are really going to be heavily relying on those review scores and making those review scores that much more impactful.
Yep. And next one here, at least in the US, we noticed that the higher price increments seem to be evident in those leisure destinations and those primary metros. So a lot of what Blake showed you, we saw a lot of kind of like spring break markets, and then we saw some really, marquee markets like LA and Miami and New York, like we saw with the 5-star example. So definitely a trend that we noticed more so in the US than in Europe.
Yep. And then last but not least, the fringe benefits that we just talked about, just taking a step back from the analytics, just purely matter of fact. Now I'm in a new ranking bucket. Now I'm going to be higher in the rankings, in an environment where we see so many short-term rentals jumping into those booking.com search results. Anything we could do to stand out over the competition is critical. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is why it is critical to understand how review scores impact your price ceiling.